For 27 years, I walked through life as a shadow, a silent partner to a man who loved the spotlight more than he loved me. I orchestrated his charity galas, managed his schedule, and smoothed over his endless gaffes, all while he took the credit, the applause, and the adoration. I told myself it was fine, that I preferred the quiet hum of accomplishment to the roar of recognition. I was wrong. The night it all shattered began like any other of Gregory's extravagant events. The ballroom glittered, the champagne flowed, and the air buzzed with the forced conviviality of the city's elite. I had spent months perfecting every detail, from the floral arrangements to the intricate seating chart, a silent architect of his public success. Gregory, of course, arrived fashionably late, sweeping in with that practiced charm that made everyone forget he was 40 minutes behind schedule. He kissed my cheek, a fleeting, perfunctory gesture, and then spent the next hour regaling board members with stories of his vision, his meticulous planning, his genius. I smiled, nodded, and refilled champagne flutes, a ghost in my own creation. The jokes started at dinner, as they always did after Gregory had a few glasses of the expensive Macallan he kept close at hand. He'd lean back, a predatory glint in his eye, and begin his ritualistic dismantling of my character. My wife, Eleanor, he'd announced to the table, still balances her checkbook by hand, probably thinks tweet is a sound a bird makes. Laughter would ripple through the table, polite at first, then growing bolder with each sip of wine. I'd offer a tight smile, my eyes fixed on some distant point, and pretend it didn't sting. Mrs. Albright, whose husband had made his fortune in industrial waste, would pat my hand with a look of pity that felt sharper than any insult. Such a traditional woman, she'd coo, and I'd just nod, my dignity a fragile shield against the rising tide of humiliation. But that night, Gregory decided to escalate. Halfway through dessert, he grabbed my hand, pulling me up onto the small stage where the band was setting up. For a fleeting second, I thought, I don't know what I thought. Perhaps a toast? An unexpected acknowledgement of my tireless work? A moment of genuine affection? The thought was so foreign, so utterly out of character for him, that it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Instead, he took the microphone from the bewildered bandleader, placed his other hand on my shoulder, as if I were a prize heifer he was presenting, and grinned at the expectant crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice amplified, echoing through the cavernous ballroom. "Tonight, we're doing something a little different. We're auctioning off my wife." A nervous titter ran through the room, quickly replaced by a wave of boisterous laughter. My blood ran cold. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. "Let's start the bidding," he continued, his eyes twinkling with cruel amusement. "At a mere $20, who wants this utterly useless wife?" The laughter swelled, a cacophony of polite society's most brutal judgment. 300 faces, faces I had smiled at, hosted, remembered birthdays for, sent handwritten thank you notes to, were now contorted in amusement, watching me, Eleanor Vance, being sold for the price of a cheap bottle of wine. I stood there, spine rigid, hands clasped in front of me, a silent statue of humiliation. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw my glass of wine in his face, though a primal, desperate part of me yearned to. I simply stood, letting the laughter wash over me, clinging to the last vestiges of my dignity. Because I had learned, over decades, that dignity is the one thing a room full of laughing people cannot take from you, unless you hand it to them yourself. Someone near the back, a portly man in an ill-fitting tuxedo, raised his paddle, a joke to keep the momentum going. $20, he called out, and more laughter followed. And then, just as suddenly, the room went quiet. A hush fell, thick and heavy, the way a room does when something real, something utterly unexpected, interrupts the carefully constructed illusion of a party. $2 million. The voice was calm, unhurried, emanating from the back of the room. It was the kind of voice that had never needed to be loud to be heard, a voice that commanded attention without demanding it. Every head in that ballroom swiveled in unison. Gregory's hand slid off my shoulder as if it had suddenly gone cold. I scanned the crowd, my eyes searching, and found him. A tall man, perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with distinguished gray at his temples, stood near the entrance in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. I didn't recognize him. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. Not pity, not amusement, but something closer to a quiet reverence that confused me more than anything else that had happened all night. Gregory, ever the showman, recovered his voice first, a short, nervous laugh escaping his lips. A generous donor indeed, he stammered, but no one was listening to him anymore. The man in gray had already begun to walk toward the stage, unhurried, the crowd parting around him as if he were the only person in the room who mattered. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my heart began to pound, not with fear, but with the strange, sudden sense that my life was about to change, and I had absolutely no say in how. He stopped a few feet from the stage, his gaze still fixed on me, the way you'd look at something you'd been searching for a very long time. Up close, his eyes were a startling shade of blue, kind and intelligent. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he said, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd behind me. Apparently that name meant something to everyone in the room except me. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption." Gregory, ever the opportunist, stepped forward, his hand extended, that practiced salesman's smile snapping back into place. "Arthur Sterling, of course we're honored. We didn't know you'd be joining us tonight. Your generosity toward the foundation is—" "I didn't come for your foundation," Arthur interrupted, his voice still calm, still even, but something in it made Gregory's hand drop back to his side without being shaken. "I came because I heard your wife would be here." The room had gone so quiet I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables away. Gregory laughed again, that same nervous sound, and glanced at me, expecting me to explain this, to produce some story that made sense of a strange man offering $2 million for a joke he himself had started. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. Have you two met? Do you know Mr. Sterling?" "No," I said, because it was true, and because I had never once in 27 years given Gregory a reason to doubt my word. I wasn't about to start in front of 300 people. Arthur turned to me then, and something in his face softened, the way a person's face softens when they finally arrive somewhere after a very long journey. "Mrs. Vance, I know this must feel strange. I promise you it isn't what it looks like." He paused, glanced once at the microphone still dangling from Gregory's hand, and then back at me. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner tomorrow evening? I have something I need to tell you, and it isn't the kind of thing that belongs in a room like this." The next evening, I met Arthur Sterling at a quiet, unassuming restaurant, a stark contrast to the opulence of the Gala. I had spent the day in a daze, fielding frantic calls from Gregory, who was convinced I was having an affair, that Arthur was some long-lost lover I'd kept secret. His accusations, once so potent, now felt hollow, distant. I simply packed a small bag and drove to my friend Margaret's house, needing space, needing to breathe. Arthur was already seated when I arrived, a single white rose in a slender vase on the table between us. He rose as I approached, a gesture of old-world courtesy I hadn't experienced in years. We ordered, and then, over a plate of perfectly seared scallops, he began to speak. 30 years ago, he started, his voice soft, I was a different man. Angry, lost, fresh out of the military with nowhere to go. My sister Clara had just passed away, and I was drowning in grief and resentment. I ended up in a bus station in Omaha, halfway across the country, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a crumpled $20 bill. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in memory. It was raining, a cold, miserable night. I was starving, but too proud, too broken to ask for help. I just sat there, trying to disappear. He looked at me then, his blue eyes piercing. "You were there. You were young, maybe in your early 20s. You had a kind face, a quiet strength about you. You bought a cup of coffee and a sandwich, and then, without a word, you sat down next to me and pushed half of it across the table. You didn't ask questions. You didn't offer pity. You just shared." My mind raced, trying to recall the memory. A bus station, a rainy night, a young man with haunted eyes. It was a fleeting moment, one of countless small acts of kindness I had performed over the years, never expecting anything in return, never remembering the faces. "That sandwich," Arthur continued, "that simple act of kindness, saved my life. It was the first time in months I felt like I wasn't completely alone. It gave me the strength to keep going, to find my way back. I promised myself that day that if I ever had the chance, I would repay that kindness, not to you directly, but to the world, in your name." He then explained how, over the decades, he had built Sterling Technologies, a successful tech company, pouring his profits into a foundation dedicated to helping veterans and young people at risk. His sister, Clara, had been his inspiration, a woman who believed in the power of a single helping hand. He had searched for me for years, hoping to tell me his story, to thank me. He had learned my name through a mutual acquaintance who had seen me at one of Gregory's galas. When he heard about the auction, he knew he had to act. The $2 million, he said, a faint smile touching his lips, was a symbolic gesture, a way to show that some things are priceless, and kindness is at the top of that list. But it was also a way to get your attention, to finally tell you this story. He then pulled a thick envelope from his inner jacket pocket, placing it gently on the table. "My sister, Clara, passed away 2 years ago. In her will, she left a significant portion of her estate to her foundation, with one very specific instruction, that if you could be found, you were to be offered a seat on the board, with a controlling share of its direction. She believed, as I do, that your quiet strength, your innate compassion, is exactly what the foundation needs." I opened the envelope later that night, alone in Margaret's guest room, where I had taken to sleeping since the gala. Clara's handwriting was small and careful, a lawyer's script, but the words were pure, heartfelt. "Dear Eleanor," it began, "if you're reading this, my brother finally found you, and I hope it wasn't too late. I want you to know that the woman who bought my brother dinner on the worst night of his life became the reason I believed for the rest of it that strangers could still be kind. Everything I built because of 1 hour you probably don't even remember spending with him. I've left instructions with my attorneys. I hope you'll accept what I'm leaving you not as payment, because you never asked for anything, but as proof that kindness doesn't disappear. It multiplies. It just takes a while to come back around." Attached were legal documents that I had to read twice to understand. Clara hadn't simply left me money, she'd left me a position, a seat on the board of the Clara Sterling Foundation, along with a controlling share of its direction going forward. Leadership, purpose, a say in where hundreds of thousands of dollars went every year toward shelters and legal aid and scholarships for kids like the young man I'd once bought a diner dinner. I sat on the edge of that unfamiliar bed for a long time, holding papers that suddenly made my hands feel like they belonged to someone else. Downstairs, Gregory was building something too, though it wasn't nearly as generous. He'd hired a private investigator by Wednesday, a man named Foster, who specialized, according to Margaret, in matrimonial cases. Gregory was convinced, in the particular way a guilty man is often convinced of other people's guilt, that Arthur and I had a history he simply hadn't uncovered yet. An affair, he assumed, something sordid enough to explain $2 million and a private dinner. He wanted proof before I could, in his words, spring anything on him in front of the lawyers. What Foster found instead unsettled him far more than an affair would have. He found teachers I'd worked alongside 20 years earlier, who remembered me keeping granola bars in my desk drawer for the kids who came to school hungry. He found a woman named Diane, a widow I'd sat with every week for 2 years after her husband died, back when Gregory was too busy building his company to notice I'd disappeared most Tuesday afternoons. He found 3 former foster children, now grown, who described a woman who'd shown up at their school plays because no one else would. He found a veteran named Harold who credited me, of all people, with helping him find the paperwork office that finally got his benefits approved after the VA had turned him away twice. None of it was dramatic. None of it was a scandal. It was just decades of small, unremarkable kindnesses that had never once made it into a conversation at Gregory's dinner table, because I had never thought they were interesting enough to mention, and he had never once asked what I did with my time that wasn't spent serving his. Foster's report landed on Gregory's desk the same week the video went viral. I don't know who filmed it, some guest with a phone, probably capturing the auction the way people capture everything now, without thinking twice. But by Thursday, the clip of Gregory holding that microphone, grinning, saying, "Let's start the bidding at $20, had been watched 4 million times. The captions people added were not kind to him, neither were the comments. A late-night host mentioned it in his monologue. A women's advocacy account reposted it with the caption, "This is what casual cruelty looks like when it's dressed in a tuxedo," and that version alone crossed 1 million views by Friday morning. Sponsors began calling the company. Two luxury developers who'd signed contracts with Gregory's firm the previous spring quietly asked their lawyers to review the exit clauses. A journalist who'd covered the gala for a local business magazine reached out to me directly for comment, and I declined, because I had nothing prepared to say and no interest in saying anything unprepared. Gregory came home Friday evening looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 days. He didn't ask about Arthur. He didn't ask about the envelope I'd been careful to keep locked in Margaret's guest room dresser. He sat at the kitchen island with his phone face down in front of him and said very quietly, "It's everywhere, Eleanor. I can't make it stop." I didn't answer him right away. I thought about Clara's letter upstairs, about the strange, quiet power of one honest hour spent with a frightened stranger, and about how differently things might have gone for Gregory if he'd ever once in 27 years wondered what I did with mine. The phone rang before I could decide what to say. Gregory answered it, listened for a long moment, and I watched the last of the color drain out of his face. "The board wants an emergency meeting," he said. "Monday morning, all of them." The board meeting lasted 90 minutes, and Gregory told me about it that night in pieces, the way a man describes something he's still too stunned to organize into a full story. 7 directors sat around the long table in the glass-walled conference room he'd once been so proud of, the one with the view of the harbor he liked to show off to new clients. And none of them, he said, would quite look him in the eye. It was Bill Ashford, the oldest of them, who finally said what the rest were thinking. "This isn't about the joke, Gregory. It's about what the joke revealed." They didn't fire him, not directly. They offered him a choice: resign as chairman and step down from the board, or face a vote of no confidence and the public humiliation that would follow. They cited conduct unbecoming of a leader, damage to the foundation's reputation, and a pattern of disregard for the contributions of others. The irony was not lost on me. He chose to resign. That spring, I accepted the position on Clara Sterling's foundation board. The first thing I did was frame Clara's letter, a reminder that true value isn't measured in dollars or applause, but in the quiet ripple effect of genuine human connection. It became my compass, guiding every decision, every initiative. I had a purpose now that didn't depend on anyone's permission. That was the part I hadn't known to hope for. Gregory resigned as chairman that same spring, and it surprised people who didn't know the whole story, though it didn't surprise me. The board hadn't forced him out, not in the end. The numbers had recovered somewhat by then, the initial outrage cooling the way these things eventually do. He resigned because, as he told me over coffee one of the last times we spoke as anything resembling a married couple, he didn't want to spend the second half of his life being a man who'd only learned decency after losing everything that mattered to him. He wanted to rebuild something smaller, something honest, even if it meant starting over at 55 with a fraction of what he'd had. We separated with more grace than either of us had shown each other in years. No courtroom shouting, no dividing of assets like weapons in a war. Just two people, finally honest with each other, signing papers at a lawyer's office and shaking hands afterward like colleagues closing out a long, complicated project. He asked, before I left that office for the last time as his wife, whether I thought we could have been happy if he'd simply paid attention sooner. I told him I didn't know, and that I'd stopped needing to know, and I think that answer surprised him more than anger would have. On a quiet Sunday in early autumn, Arthur and I drove out to the cemetery where Clara was buried, a modest stone under an oak tree just beginning to turn gold at the edges. Arthur had brought white lilies, her favorite, he told me, and set them carefully against the base of the headstone, while I stood a step behind him, giving him the moment alone that grief sometimes needs before it can be shared. When he stepped back, I knelt down myself and rested my hand flat against the cool stone, feeling the carved letters of her name under my palm. "You thought I saved your life," I said quietly, not caring that Arthur could hear me, because I think some part of him needed to hear it too. "But I've been thinking about it for months now, and I believe you saved mine right back. I just didn't know it yet. It took 30 years for the debt to come due, and I got the better end of the bargain by far." Arthur didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way you comfort someone who doesn't need comforting so much as company. And we stood there together a while longer in the gold autumn light before turning to walk back toward the car. That was when I saw her, a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, sitting alone on a bench, just outside the cemetery gates, a duffel bag at her feet, her arms wrapped around herself against the wind. Though the day wasn't especially cold, she had the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to be noticed, and the particular fear of someone who has learned that being noticed rarely goes well for her. I recognized that stillness. I had seen it once before, 30 years ago, under a bus station awning in the rain, and I had carried the memory of it without even realizing for every year since. I didn't hesitate. I walked over, sat down on the far end of the bench, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her, and I asked the only question that had ever mattered in moments like this one. "Would you like to sit with me for a while?" She looked at me, startled, wary, and then slowly, something in her shoulders loosened just slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. She nodded, and the cycle that started with a stranger and a diner booth 30 years ago began again, quietly, the way it always had, without an audience, without applause, without anyone keeping score. Sometimes people laugh while they decide your worth. They hold up the microphone, they set the price, they wait for the room to agree with them, but life has a way of letting time settle the real account, long after the laughter has faded and the room has emptied out. And when it finally does, you learn the truth of it. Kindness is always worth more than those who mock it could ever afford to pay. This story is a work of fiction. Any